right, so we finished up talking about comparative nutritive value and why, when it comes to parts of the plant, especially in shrubs, leaves are way more nutritious than stems because they have more cellular contents and less structural carbohydrates or less lignin. And then also, our shrubs are going to have multiple seasons of growth associated with them, but the older the growth, the more lignified that material is, so it becomes less palatable too. So when we look more closely at browse or shrubs, um, our browse area is really going to be the portion of the shrub that's going to be used for forage. So this tends to be the leaves and then young twigs as well. So, and by young twigs, I mean the current season twigs. So some of our shrubs are going to have flowers associated with them, and that provides really high amounts of protein for our browsers. So that's why we see like deer and elk and some of our concentrate selectors really utilize the flower portion of shrubs when that time of the year comes around. When we talk about maturation effects and how that affects the quality of a plant, this really plays into the degree of lignification as well as the increased structural carbohydrates. So CHOs are an abbreviation for carbohydrates. And when we think about plants on rangeland, they're going to be very nutritious when they're very young. So in our annual plants, when those grasses start to come on about December, January, those grasses are going to be very, very highly palatable. They're soft, they're sweet, they have really good response system back to the neuro center of the grazing animal. They have a good experience with it, so they tend to they tend to be utilized more in the juvenile stage rather than in the maturity stage. So this is true even for plants that are normally considered undesirable. So cheatgrass isn't highly desirable, and neither is medusa head or goat grass. But when they are young, the animals will eat them because they do have a certain amount of sugar associated with them, and that provides a positive feedback for the grazing animal. So some of the mature or as a plant matures, it's going to lose some of its nutrient value. And this is because we have increased structural carbohydrates. We have increased degree of lignification, so we're adding more and more lignin to the stems in our shrubs. And then we're also increasing the amount of stem compared to the amount of leaf that's actually available. So that ratio is starting to increase as well. So in areas that receive a lot of rain, like sometimes here in California, this year is a good example, or the southeast, we can actually see nutrients that are going to be leaching out of the soil and out of the plant if rain is going to be very or is going to come in large amounts. So these rain events can cause leaching, which is going to wash soluble nutrients out of the plant and into the soil. So those plants are going to, or there's some plants that have evolved in these areas that resist leaching because of dry climate, morphology, or areas on a piece of rangeland that are said to cure well. So curing is where we have distinguishable seasons in our perennial grasses. So like green up is very distinguishable from dormancy. So when we look at grasses, forbs, and shrubs, they're going to have changing protein content and changing nutritive value in general over the course of the year. So the next couple of slides we're going to look at are going to be set up the same way. So we've got our seasons on the bottom representing an entire year. And then we have the relative amounts of nutritive value on the y-axis. So our forbs are going to be this red line, our grasses are going to be the dashed green line, and the browse or the shrubs are going to be the dotted blue line. So with this figure is really depicting some of the trends that we see from season to season in not only protein content, but also phosphorus and vitamin A in some of our range forages. So here in North America, during the springtime, all three types of plants see an increase in protein content, phosphorus, and vitamin A. However, we're going to see that peak actually happen towards the end of spring, first part of summer, and then the nutritive value and the protein content is going to start waning off as we move into summer, and then it's even going to get lower and lower as we move into fall and winter. And once we get to winter, it's going to actually stay pretty pretty stable from that point on. So a grass is going to offer a lot of nutrients in the spring and early summer. So when we look at this relationship during the growing season, which is going to be spring and summer, forbs tend to be the most nutritious. So they're going to have the most protein content, phosphorus, and vitamin A. And they're going to be more nutritious than our grasses. And then our grasses are going to be more nutritious than our shrubs. And the reason for this is because the cell wall of the grass is going to be a lot thicker than the cell wall of the forb. So if you guys remember me telling you, in late April we get about 3 days of nasty, nasty north wind. I'm really hoping that didn't happen in March this year. And it dries out all the forbs. So forbs have a very broad leaf, which means that there's a lot of water associated with that leaf material. So as soon as that plant dies, after it's shed its seeds, and we get some extra drying in the environment, like a nasty north wind, those forbs essentially dry up and actually will blow away. So that's one of the big reasons that our forbs, they're going to be very high in protein, and then they're going to plummet as we move from spring into summer. When we look at the dormant season, so fall and winter here in North America, our browse or our shrubs are going to be really important for nutrients on our rangeland grazing animals, specifically wildlife, because they're going to hold their nutritive value better than the forbs and the grasses will as residual dry matter. So when we think more specifically about the two types of grasses that we see in rangelands here in the U.S., our cool season versus our warm season grasses. We've found through extensive research that our warm season grasses, or our C4s, are much less nutritious as a whole than our cool season grasses. And this is really because the morphology associated with the warm season grasses contain more epidermis, more vascular tissue, and more overall cell wall material. So because there's more cell wall material, there's more extensive lignification that takes place in these grasses, making them less palatable than our cool season plants. And less palatable means less nutritious. So again, as we look at a different trend, the graph here is set up the very same way. So we've got our seasons on the x-axis, the relative amounts on the y-axis, and instead of protein content, what we're looking at here is digestible energy content in our forages. And we see a little bit of a difference compared to the protein content. So in spring and summer, we still see that big bump in total digestible energy associated with the plant. We still see a drop off as we move into summer, and then we still see continued drop off and sustained levels as we move from fall into winter. So that overall trend remains the same. However, when we look at the energy portion of a plant, our forbs are going to actually increase in digestible energy and be almost as digestive or have almost as much energy as our grasses do. However, they're going to fall off quite quickly. And our grasses are going to fall off quickly as well, but grasses in general are going to hold more digestible energy through the dormant period than our forbs and our browse. So our browse is actually the most consistent. Yes, we see a big bump in digestible energy in the spring, but they're not gonna have as much flux and variation as our grasses will. So again, as we look at or keep this chart in mind about digestible energy, we can see that during the growing season, our grasses, forbs, and shrubs all provide really good amounts of energy. However, during the dormant season, grasses are going to provide a more stable source of energy than our forbs or our browse. All right, so let's switch gears really quickly and talk about anti-quality agents. So these are going to be secondary compounds that are going to have a negative effect on the palatability of a plant. So these anti-quality agents are most common in forbs and shrubs. So we see these in things that flower. We very rarely see any anti-quality agents with grasses. These agents can come in two major forms, inhibitors or toxins. Inhibitors have the ability to cause illness in an animal and inhibit the digestive process. Usually what ends up happening is that the compound associated with the plant, once it's ingested, is going to react with dietary proteins and is going to form complexes in the rumen or the lower GI that is going to basically limit the degradation of the microbial populations. So this actually inhibits digestion and inhibits microbial growth so that the bugs in the rumen or the bugs in the cecum, if we're talking about horses, are not going to turn over as quickly. Therefore, digestion is just going to slow down. The second type of anti-quality agent is the ones that cause illness or death, and those are toxins. So these are going to mostly be in the form of alkaloids, terpenines, and saponins. And so we've got a couple poisonous plants that we see in California, but they're so bitter that animals really have to eat a lot of it to actually be affected or to intake the toxin. All right, so as we wrap up this last part of the nutritive value lecture, just keep in mind that forbs are really important sources of protein and vitamin A during the growing season. However, shrubs take on the role of being very important to maintain phosphorus levels as well as protein levels during the winter or the dormant season. Grasses are going to be high sources of energy because they have large amounts of structural carbohydrates, and they're going to have higher amounts of energy throughout the entire year compared to the forbs and the browse species. And finally, just keep in mind as a caution that forbs and shrubs, anything that can flower, may contain anti-quality agents in the form of inhibitors or toxins, which are going to decrease the value of that plant. All right, so we have finished up nutritive value, and we will see you guys in class.